Korean Peninsula has long stood as one of the most tense and heavily militarized regions in the world. For decades, North Korea has remained one of the most secretive, repressive, and isolated countries on Earth. Ruled with an iron grip by the Kim dynasty, it has survived through extreme authoritarianism, nuclear brinkmanship, and carefully managed propaganda. But what if that regime suddenly collapses? What if, either through internal rebellion, leadership death, military coup, economic implosion, or external intervention, the North Korean state as we know it ceases to exist? The consequences of such a collapse would be profound, unpredictable, and global in scale. To imagine the fall of the regime is to enter a scenario that is both hopeful and terrifying. For some, the end of the Kim dynasty would signal the end of tyranny, the long-awaited liberation for over 25 million Koreans. But for others, it represents a ticking time bomb of nuclear insecurity, mass migration, humanitarian crisis, and geopolitical chaos. The collapse would not be a singular event, but a prolonged and destabilizing process with ripples that could reach every major power in the world. The initial trigger could take many forms. The death of Kim Jong-un without a clear successor could throw the country into political disarray. A military coup could pit elite factions against each other, leading to civil conflict. An uprising fueled by famine, economic collapse, or increased information from the outside world could rapidly escalate beyond government control. Or external military pressure from the US or South Korea could shatter the fragile internal balance, toppling the regime in days and weeks. Regardless of the cause, the first stage of collapse would almost certainly be confusion and chaos at the highest levels of government. North Korea's centralized control means that the sudden absence of leadership would paralyze the system. Ministries would grind to a halt. Communication between military regions might break down, and local authorities, long dependent on direction of Pyongyang, could act unpredictably. Armed units could turn against each other in a bid for power or resources. Warlordism might arise as generals or political elites carve out zones of influence. The country could fracture into competing factions, some loyal to the memory of the regime, others simply seeking to survive. Meanwhile, the general population, isolated from the outside world and already suffering from chronic poverty, would be thrust into the survival crisis. Food shortages could spiral into famine as supply chains disintegrate. Healthcare services, already rudimentary, would collapse entirely. Without a functioning government, there would be no coordinated relief, no public order, and no protection from looting or violence. Millions could attempt to flee, creating a humanitarian catastrophe on North Korea's borders. The most immediate concern for the world would be the control of North Korea's nuclear weapons. It is estimated that the country possesses between 40 to 60 nuclear warheads and delivery systems capable of reaching Japan, South Korea, and even parts of the US mainland. In a post-collapse environment, securing these weapons would become an urgent and dangerous priority. Rogue commanders or military units might attempt to use them to gain leverage, or worse, sell them to terrorist organizations. The threat of loose nukes would compel immediate international intervention. China, which shares a long border with North Korea and has historically supported the regime to prevent instability, would likely move quickly to secure its frontier and possibly enter the country to safeguard its interests. China fears a flood of refugees crossing into its northeastern provinces and the possibility of US or South Korean troops approaching its border. Thus, a Chinese military presence in northern North Korea could be expected within days of a collapse, justified as a peacekeeping mission or a humanitarian effort. At the same time, South Korea and the United States would likely initiate their own operations from the south to secure key military facilities, nuclear sites, and provide humanitarian relief. This sets the stage for a dangerous standoff between the world's two largest powers on Korean soil. Miscommunication or territorial overreach could trigger armed clashes. Coordination would be essential but difficult, especially in a fog of war scenario where neither side trusts the other's intentions. The Korean Peninsula could become the epicenter of a new Cold War-style confrontation, one that risks direct conflict between China and the US. Simultaneously, South Korea would face an overwhelming challenge. The Despite its preparedness for eventual reunification, the reality would be daunting. The economic, social, and infrastructural costs of absorbing a failed state with 25 million impoverished, traumatized people would dwarf even the German reunification of the 1990s. The South's economy, although strong, would be stretched thin. Integrating North Koreans into a democratic society with market capitalism, freedom of speech, and modern technology would take decades. The cultural divide between North and South, widened by 70 years of separation, would not vanish overnight. The psychological trauma among North Koreans would be vast. Generations have been raised in an environment of total propaganda, convinced of the regime's divinity and the enemy nature of the outside world. Suddenly exposed to global reality, many would experience intense confusion, disillusionment, or identity crisis. Re-education and social reintegration programs would be necessary but controversial. The world would watch as an entire nation attempts to unlearn decades of indoctrination. Refugee flows would extend beyond China. Boats filled with desperate North Koreans could land on Japanese shores. Southeast Asian nations, already wary of illegal migration, might find themselves receiving new waves of displaced people. The global refugee system, already strained by conflicts elsewhere, would be forced to adapt rapidly. The humanitarian response would need to be massive, multinational, and sustained over years. Global markets would react violently to the initial shock. Investors would panic at the threat of conflict between major powers, the uncertainty around nuclear assets, and the instability in a critical region of Asia. Stock markets might tumble. Supply chains, especially in electronics and automobiles, could be disrupted as South Korea diverts its economic resources to crisis management. The ripple effects could cause a global slowdown or even a short-term recession. Yet amid this crisis, there would also be opportunity. The fall of North Korea's regime could open the door to long-term peace on the Korean Peninsula. A unified Korea, once stabilized, would become an economic powerhouse, combining South Korea's innovation with the untapped natural resources and labor of the North. Infrastructure projects could link the peninsula to China and Russia via rail, opening new trade routes and transforming regional dynamics. Diplomatic relations long frozen could thaw, and a unified Korea could serve as a bridge between East and West. But success would depend on international cooperation, patience, and vision. If handled poorly, the collapse could lead to decades of instability, insurgency, and division. If handled wisely, it could signal the end of one of the last Cold War conflicts and the birth of a new chapter in East Asian history. The question of justice would also loom large. Former regime officials, many of whom are responsible for crimes against humanity, might seek asylum or attempt to hide within the chaos. A post-collapse government, whether transitional or elected, would face pressure to prosecute those responsible for labor camps, torture, and mass executions. International courts could become involved. At the same time, some South Koreans might push for truth and reconciliation efforts rather than punishment, to promote unity and healing. The path forward would not be easy, and internal debates could fracture efforts at building a cohesive national identity. Religious and humanitarian organizations, which have long struggled to gain access to North Korea, would likely flood in once borders are opened. Aid would be desperately needed, but so would regulation and coordination. Not all groups would have good intentions. In the vacuum of collapsed authority, some may exploit vulnerable populations. The international community would need to ensure that relief efforts are safe, transparent, and accountable. The collapse would also reshape power dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan might feel compelled to boost its military posture, fearing instability or the expansion of Chinese influence. Russia, watching from the north, might increase its involvement to protect its interests in the region. The U.S. would face a critical diplomatic balancing act, supporting reunification without provoking China or overextending itself militarily. Within China, the collapse of its neighbor and client state could trigger introspection. The Chinese Communist Party might fear similar unrest or question its long-standing support for the Kim regime. A successful Korean reunification led by a democratic government could inspire reformist movements within China. or harden authoritarian control in response to perceived threats. Either outcome would be consequential far beyond the Korean Peninsula. As months turn into years, the reconstruction of the North would be one of the greatest challenges the modern world has ever faced. Infrastructure would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Roads, hospitals, schools, communication systems. The economy would need to transition from command-based to market-driven, with massive investments required. Education systems would need reform to reflect historical truth and global reality. All of this would take not just money, but time, trust, and sustained global attention. The cultural integration would be no less demanding. How do you bring together two populations separated by language nuance, worldview, education, and experience? How do you unite a people who've grown up believing the other side was their enemy? South Korean society would need to adapt as well, welcoming northern citizens not as burdens, but as fellow Koreans deserving equal rights and dignity. Media, education, public discourse, all would play roles in shaping a unified national identity. Looking forward, a unified Korea could eventually emerge stronger and more resilient. Its strategic location, innovative spirit, and shared heritage could create a vibrant democracy and a major regional player. But the scars of collapse, war, and division would take generations to heal. The world must be prepared to walk alongside Korea through this journey, not just in the headlines, but in commitment and action. The collapse of the North Korean regime is not just a regional issue. It is a global event with the potential to reshape geopolitics, economics, human rights, and international law. It would be a moment of immense danger and equally immense possibility. The path taken in those first chaotic days would determine not just the future of the Korean Peninsula, but the character of the 21st century itself.